It was one of those particularly fine afternoons in early June when all of England seems to remember its ancient reputation for gardens. The roses in Brindleford were in their full, blousy pride, the hollyhocks already reaching ambitiously for the sky, and even the modest cottage borders seemed to have burst into color with a determination to impress. It was the day of the annual garden fete at the vicarage, and the whole village had turned out. The vicarage lawns were dotted with stalls, white tents fluttering gently in the warm breeze. There was a tombola arranged by the Women's Institute, a table of homemade preserves where Mrs. Drayton presided with the authority of a general commanding troops, and a small tent where local children, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, performed recitations for the amusement of their elders. Really, one might almost imagine we were back in 1938, murmured Mrs. Bantry, a plump, cheerful woman with a sharp eye for her neighbors' missteps. She smoothed down her floral dress, balancing a plate of sponge cake. The war, rationing, and all those dreary shortages might never have happened at all. I always say Brindleford has a way of keeping itself unspoiled. Until one remembers the roads, returned Mrs. Price, a tall, angular woman whose every remark seemed to carry a note of disapproval. I nearly ruined my tires driving in from Marleycombe. But of course the council does nothing at all. Their exchange was overheard by Miss Jane Marple, who had been persuaded to spend a fortnight with her old friend, Mrs. Bantry. Seated comfortably on a deck chair with her knitting bag by her side, Miss Marple appeared to be entirely absorbed in a pair of needles flashing quietly in the afternoon light. But her pale blue eyes, keen as ever, missed very little of the scene. The fete, with its gaiety and neighborly chatter, was precisely the sort of occasion she enjoyed, not for the entertainment, but for the observation it afforded. Human nature, Miss Marple always insisted, could be studied in a village as readily as anywhere else, and with far greater clarity. The vicar himself, genial and perspiring in the sun, moved about the crowd with words of encouragement for each stall. His wife, efficient and motherly, was attempting to marshal the children's choir into some semblance of harmony. Young Dr. Leslie, Brindleford's new doctor, was speaking with surprising animation to pretty Lucy Armitage, daughter of the late colonel. Lucy laughed a little too readily, and Miss Marple caught the quick narrowing of eyes from Mrs. Drayton, who disliked Lucy for reasons of her own. The tombola was attracting great interest. Mr. Henry Carroway, retired solicitor, had just won a silver-plated teapot, much to the envy of Mrs. Price, who had coveted it herself. At the same moment, Captain Fenton, tall, ruddy, and just a touch too loud, lost his temper over a miscount of tickets. A small scene ensued, quickly smoothed over by the vicar's wife, though not before several pairs of ears had eagerly tuned in. "Dear me," said Mrs. Bantry in an undertone to Miss Marple, "Captain Fenton has grown more irascible with age. I remember when he first came to Brindleford, all charm and gallantry. Now it is nothing but bluster and complaints." Miss Marple smiled faintly and did not answer. Her needles clicked gently, but her eyes had followed Captain Fenton's retreating back. She had observed the quickness of his temper, yes, but also the look of mingled relief and calculation on the face of his wife, a pale little woman in a lilac dress. Tea was served on the long trestle tables under a striped marquee. There were plates of cucumber sandwiches, currant buns, and at the center a magnificent sponge cake prepared by Mrs. Drayton, who had boasted of it for weeks beforehand. It was cut ceremoniously, admired, and consumed with great satisfaction by nearly all. Conversation, as always in such settings, turned easily to speculation about neighbors. Mrs. Price, leaning confidentially toward Mrs. Bantry, whispered something about Lucy Armitage and the new doctor, Mrs. Bantry. With the relish of a woman who enjoys a morsel of scandal but not too much of it, relayed the remark to Miss Marple. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest instant. "Young people will be young people," she said mildly, "and sometimes it is better not to draw conclusions too soon." That might have ended the matter, but just at that moment a commotion arose near the marquee. A small crowd had gathered around one of the tables where Captain Fenton, his voice raised and urgent, bent over something, or rather someone. A gasp went through the crowd. Lucy Armitage, so vivacious a short while earlier, was lying on the grass, her face pale as chalk. Dr. Leslie, his professional instincts instantly engaged, was kneeling beside her, loosening her collar and calling for water. "She fainted, poor dear," cried Mrs. Drayton, though her expression was less concerned than triumphant, as though the incident had somehow confirmed her earlier disapproval. "More than a faint, I think," muttered Dr. Leslie grimly, checking Lucy's pulse. "Someone fetch brandy quickly." The village, so merry a moment before, was hushed into anxious silence. People whispered, speculated, and exchanged fearful glances. Miss Marple rose quietly. From her chair, her knitting left neatly folded upon it. She stepped closer, observing not only Lucy's prone form, but the reactions of those about her. Mrs. Fenton clutched her husband's arm with white knuckles. Henry Carroway had retreated slightly, his face pinched. And Mrs. Drayton, always so sure of herself, looked almost startled. Within minutes, Lucy stirred weakly. Color returned faintly to her cheeks, and she opened her eyes in confusion. Relief rippled through the crowd, though the incident had undeniably cast a shadow upon the fate. "It's the heat," declared Mrs. Price with finality. The poor girl ought never to have been standing so long in the sun, but Dr. Leslie's expression was not entirely convinced. He escorted Lucy gently to a chair, insisting she rest. Conversation gradually resumed, though in lowered tones, and the fete carried on, yet the gaiety had gone out of it. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, watched carefully. Her expression was mild, but her eyes were thoughtful. She had seen such scenes before. Sudden illness. In the midst of festivity, whispered speculation. Small jealousies magnified into rumors. They were patterns she recognized as readily as a stitch in her knitting. Later, as the sun dipped and the villagers began to drift home, Mrs. Bantry remarked, "Well, Jane, what do you think of Brindleford's fate?" "Quite a success. Don't you agree, except, of course, for poor Lucy's mishap?" Miss Marple looked at her friend. Her manner was serene, almost placid, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes. "My dear," she said gently, "I have long since learned that there is very little in village life that can be put down to mere chance. Accidents do occur, of course. But sometimes," she paused, her needles once again clicking softly in her bag, "sometimes they do not." And with that quiet pronouncement, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, while the shadows lengthened across the lawn of Brindleford Vicarage. By the following morning, Brindleford was alive with speculation. Nothing, not even the delivery of fresh trout to the butcher's shop or the arrival of the draper's van from Marleycombe, could distract the villagers from the single subject that occupied every tongue: Lucy Armitage's collapse at the fete. At the post office, Mrs. Price declared with the solemnity of a judge that it was no mere fainting fit. She spoke in tones that suggested she possessed hidden medical knowledge, though her expertise was limited to an overuse of patent remedies. She looked positively stricken, Mrs. Price confided to the postmistress. "I said to myself at once, there is more to this than the sun. You mark my words." At the grocer's, Mrs. Drayton offered her own opinion, which carried great weight among the Women's Institute. It was the cake, she insisted with relish, ignoring the fact that Lucy had eaten only the smallest slice. "I told them that recipe was too rich for a delicate stomach. Eggs and butter in that quantity." "Well, really, Young ladies today cannot digest such things. In my day." The grocer, wisely, made no reply, though he stored the remark away for later amusement. At the doctor's surgery, meanwhile, Dr. Leslie himself was grave but reticent. He told Mrs. Bantry, who had presented herself under the pretext of a slight twinge in her ankle, that Lucy had suffered a sudden weakness, but I'll not be drawn further. Exhaustion, perhaps. Or nerves, was all he would say. His manner suggested that the subject was not open to village gossip, which naturally inflamed curiosity all the more. By elevenses, every cottage and shop was humming with contradictory versions of events. Some whispered that Lucy had been secretly unwell for weeks. Others, that she had been upset by a quarrel with Captain Fenton. One or two, emboldened by imagination, hinted at poison. Miss Marple, seated in Mrs. Bantry's sunny drawing-room, listened to her friend's animated recitation of the rumors with her usual serenity. "It's extraordinary, Jane, how quickly these things fly about," said Mrs. Bantry, pouring out the tea. "I dare say Lucy herself would be astonished to hear half of it. Poison indeed. Whoever would wish her harm?" Miss Marple accepted her cup with a small nod of thanks. "It is very seldom, dear, that poison is used without a reason. The difficulty lies in discovering whether there was motive, and if so, whose." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "You speak as though we were already in the middle of a murder case." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have learned never to dismiss possibilities. Life has taught me that what seems improbable in a small village is often precisely what occurs. One must always consider human nature. And human nature is much the same here in Brindleford as it is anywhere." She returned to her knitting, but her eyes were thoughtful. She had noticed the expressions of several villagers at the fete: Mrs. Fenton's tight grip on her husband's arm, Henry Carraway's withdrawal, Mrs. Drayton's peculiar look of satisfaction. Such things, to Miss Marple, were not to be ignored. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a gentle walk through the village. She stopped at the post office under the pretext of purchasing stamps, at the grocer's for a small packet of tea, and at the churchyard where she admired the roses. At each place she was greeted with curiosity, for Brindleford had quickly absorbed her presence as Mrs. Bantry's guest, and many villagers felt she would be an excellent recipient for their own opinions. Mrs. Price accosted her outside the post office. "It was nerves, mark my words," she declared. "That girl has always been too highly strung, flirting with one man, laughing with another. I dare say she worked herself into a state. The young doctor is too indulgent with her. That's the trouble." Miss Marple agreed mildly, though she stored away the information. It was interesting to note the sharpness of Mrs. Price's tone when speaking of Lucy, as though there were envy or disapproval at the root of it. At the grocer's, Mrs. Drayton intercepted her. "My cake was never at fault," she. "Young doctor is too indulgent with her. That's the trouble." Miss Marple agreed mildly, though she stored away the information. It was interesting to note the sharpness of Mrs. Price's tone when speaking of Lucy, as though there were envy or disapproval at the root of it. At the grocer's, Mrs. Drayton intercepted her. "My cake was never at fault," she said stoutly, though no one had accused it directly. "Lucy Armitage is fanciful, that's the truth. Always putting on airs, like her dear Colonel father before her. A man with a fine uniform and very little substance. Well, she takes after him." Miss Marple, with a sweet smile, purchased her tea and remarked only that Lucy had seemed a charming young woman. But she noted the spite in Mrs. Drayton's words and the eagerness with which they were spoken. At the churchyard gate she encountered Mrs. Fenton, alone and looking pale. Miss Marple paused, offering a friendly word. "Such a distressing business yesterday," she said gently. "I do hope Lucy has recovered." Mrs. Fenton's hands twisted in her gloves. "Oh yes, at least, that is what Dr. Leslie says. But you know how people talk." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "It has upset Captain Fenton dreadfully. He cannot bear a scene." Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic. She noticed, however, that Mrs. Fenton spoke more of her husband's feelings than of the poor girl herself. By evening, the rumors had become so elaborate that they had reached the ears of Inspector Graves, the local policeman. He was a solid, unimaginative man with a red face and a tidy mustache. Called to the vicarage to reassure the family, he pronounced stoutly that it was nothing more than a feint and that villagers should hold their tongues. But Brindleford, like any village, thrived on whispers. The stern words of an inspector were no match for curiosity. That night at the Bantries, after supper, Miss Marple sat with her knitting while Mrs. Bantry sorted through household bills. The old lady's needles clicked steadily as she spoke. "You see, Dolly, I cannot help feeling that there was something not entirely natural in Lucy's collapse." "Jane, you don't mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is far too soon to mean anything at all. But I have observed certain looks, certain tones of voice. They remind me of other occasions I have known, in St. Mary Mead, for instance, when poor Mrs. Harbottle was taken suddenly ill at the whist drive. Everyone said it was the pickled onions. But in truth, it was something far more deliberate." Mrs. Bantry shivered with a mixture of horror and delight. "Oh, Jane, you always do see what the rest of us miss." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not always. But I have lived long enough to know that where there is smoke, there is often fire. It may be a small fire or it may be rather larger. Time will tell." The following morning brought fresh fuel to the gossip mill. Lucy Armitage herself appeared in the village, pale but determined, leaning on the arm of Dr. Leslie. They walked slowly past the shops, acknowledging greetings. "She looks quite restored," said Mrs. Price grudgingly, though she added, "Too much coddling from the doctor, if you ask me." Mrs. Drayton, seeing them together, pursed her lips. "Mark my words, there will be talk. A young girl like Lucy and a bachelor doctor? It does not look well." Miss Marple, watching from the window of the Bantry's drawing-room, said nothing, but she observed the faint smile on Lucy's lips as she looked up at Dr. Leslie and the protective manner in which he steadied her. She also noted the way Mrs. Fenton, passing in a pony trap, stared at the pair with undisguised alarm. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was wonderfully consistent. Envy, affection, jealousy, pride, they were the same in Brindleford as in St. Mary Mead, as in London or anywhere else. One had only to observe carefully, and in time the truth revealed itself. And so, as the church clock struck 12, Brindleford's gossip reached its peak. Behind the lace curtains, over tea tables, and across garden fences, tongues wagged tirelessly. The fete, which had begun so merrily, was now the center of suspicion and unease. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet concentration. There was, she felt, a pattern forming, threads that might yet knit together into something darker than the villagers imagined. Inspector Graves was not a man to be hurried. He believed in common sense, in order, and in what he referred to, with pride, as the obvious answer. In his opinion, village gossip was both a nuisance and a distraction. But the sheer volume of speculation surrounding Lucy Armitage's collapse had become impossible to ignore. By the second morning, Graves had made up his mind to act. "It won't do," he said heavily to Sergeant Collins, a younger, eager man who assisted him. "People jabbering on about poison and plots. We must put a stop to it. I'll settle the matter once and for all." Sergeant Collins, who had a taste for drama, asked hopefully, "So you do think it was poison, sir?" Graves frowned. "Nonsense. But I dare say someone put something in the girl's tea as a prank, ill-judged, foolish, but not murder. And if so, it's a case of showing the culprit up, giving them a scare, and shutting the village mouths. With this sound reasoning, Graves set about looking for the obvious culprit. That same afternoon, a small crowd gathered outside the post office as word spread Mr. Henry Carraway, retired solicitor, had been interviewed at length by Inspector Graves. Carraway, a spare, dry man with iron-gray hair, was known for his punctilious habits and his frequent disapproval of modern manners. He had quarreled with Captain Fenton over some obscure boundary dispute years ago and was generally regarded as difficult. "I always said Carraway was a peculiar fellow," Mrs. Price declared, her voice carrying clearly. "Never trust a man who lives alone with nothing but law books for company. They say he makes up wills for villagers without charging. Well, there's always something behind that sort of generosity. And he won that teapot at the tombola, don't forget," put in Mrs. Drayton meaningfully. "I saw him pouring out cups from it later. Suppose he slipped something into Lucy's?" This neat theory spread like wildfire. By tea-time, half of Brindleford had convinced itself that Henry Carraway was guilty of some mischief. The other half nodded knowingly and said they had always suspected him. At the Bantrys, Mrs. Bantry repeated the news with relish. "They say the inspector kept him for nearly an hour. Oh, Jane, isn't it thrilling?" Of course, Henry Carraway does look the type, doesn't he? Quiet men so often have something to hide. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. She raised her eyes with mild surprise. "My dear, I always think quiet men are no more likely to be guilty than noisy ones. One must look, not at appearances, but at motives." Now what motive could poor Mr. Carraway possibly have had for wishing harm to Lucy Armitage? Mrs. Bantry looked momentarily deflated. "Well, none, I suppose. Except that he disapproves of young people, as we all know." "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is not quite the same thing." Meanwhile, Inspector Graves was feeling satisfied. He had questioned Carraway sternly about his movements during the fete. Carraway had admitted with irritation that he had indeed poured tea from his newly won teapot. At the vicar's request, to assist with the crowd, he explained. "But you gave Miss Armitage her cup yourself?" Graves pressed. Carraway frowned. "I gave many people cups. She may have been one of them." "I cannot remember." This vagueness, which to Carraway seemed perfectly natural, appeared highly suspicious to Graves. He allowed himself a little triumph. Here was a man of solitary habits, brusque manners, and no alibi worth mentioning. What more could one want? "Mark my words, Collins," he said as they left Carraway's neat little house. "That fellow knows more than he's telling. These dry old bachelors, there's always a twist in them." Collins, who admired his superior's certainty, nodded vigorously. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the Bantry's garden, was not so easily convinced. Henry Carraway might be brusque, even disagreeable, but she had served him at the fete. She remembered his satisfaction at winning the teapot, his dry little smile, his retreat into the background when Lucy collapsed. It was not the behavior of a man who had expected such drama. She recalled, too, the subtle expressions of others. Mrs. Drayton's momentary look of triumph, quickly masked, Mrs. Fenton's white-knuckled grip upon her husband, Captain Fenton's bluster concealing something more. Human nature, she reflected, rarely fitted the neat categories into which Inspector Graves liked to place it. The truth was seldom obvious. The gossip intensified over the next day. Villagers passed Carraway's house with furtive curiosity. Some claimed they had seen him buying unusual powders at the chemist's. Others insisted he had spoken harshly to Lucy in the past, though no one could recall when. Lucy herself, pale but recovering, heard of the rumors with indignation. "Mr. Carraway? But he is nothing to me. Why should he wish me harm?" she exclaimed to Dr. Leslie. The young doctor frowned. "It is absurd, of course. Graves has seized on him because he's awkward. But Lucy, I must ask you, did you taste anything odd in your tea that day?" Lucy hesitated. There was a bitterness, perhaps. But then I was faint already. It may have been my imagination. The doctor's concern deepened. He made a private note of her words, though he would not repeat them lightly. That evening, Mrs. Price encountered Miss Marple outside the churchyard. "Of course you've heard, Miss Marple, that they think Caraway did it. Well, I am not surprised. Too quiet by half, that one, and always prowling about the lanes at odd hours. Mark my words, he'll end badly." Miss Marple looked at her with mild interest. "Do you think so, Mrs. Price? To me he seems a lonely man, not a wicked one." Mrs. Price sniffed. "Lonely or not, I wouldn't trust him an inch." "Why? Only last winter he had a quarrel with Captain Fenton over some chickens straying. A temper like that one never forgets." Miss Marple murmured something agreeable, but her mind was already elsewhere. Captain Fenton's temper, yes, that was something she had indeed observed. And tempers, in her long experience, were often more dangerous than silences. Inspector Graves, however, pressed forward. The following day, Henry Caraway was formally asked to remain in his house pending further inquiries. This, in the minds of Brindleford, was as good as an arrest. Villagers congratulated themselves on their perspicacity. The case, they agreed, was as good as solved. But not to Miss Marple. Sitting by the Bantry's fire that evening, she laid aside her knitting and looked thoughtfully into the flames. "Dolly," she said quietly, "have you ever noticed how people prefer the simple story, even when it is not the true one? They feel safer when they believe the culprit is someone apart, a man like Henry Caraway set apart from the rest. It reassures them that wickedness does not lie within their own circle." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Do you mean, Jane, that you think Henry Caraway is innocent?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "My dear, I never think until I am quite sure. But I do observe, and what I observe tells me that this business is far from over." And so, as Brindleford congratulated itself on its swift resolution, Miss Marple quietly kept her counsel. She knew, as surely as she knew the pattern of her knitting, that the threads had not yet come together. Another stitch, another row, and the true design would begin to show. If Inspector Graves believed that naming Henry Caraway had ended the matter, he was mistaken. Far from quieting gossip, the inspector's pronouncement only gave it fresh life. Brindleford was not content with the solution handed down by authority. It demanded to embroider, embellish, and explain. And in so doing, secrets, carefully kept for years, began to come loose at the seams. Mrs. Bantry, who could never resist the thrill of half-heard whispers, bustled into her drawing-room that morning with the air of a woman carrying treasure. Miss Marple, sitting peacefully by the window with her knitting, looked up with mild interest. "Jane, you'll never believe it. Mrs. Price swears she overheard Captain Fenton shouting at Lucy Armitage in the lane last week. Something about her being a little fool who didn't know what was good for her. Now, what do you make of that?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature, dear. Quarrels are seldom as simple as they appear. One must always ask, what lies beneath?" Mrs. Bantry, delighted, settled down to pour out tea. "There's more. Mr. Caraway may not be the only one with cause to dislike Lucy. You know Mrs. Drayton has always disapproved of her. Well, it seems Lucy once turned down her son's proposal. She thought she could do better, apparently." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. Her needles clicked. "Wounded pride. That is a motive stronger than many imagine." At the same hour, in the snug of the King's Arms, Captain Fenton was telling his version of events to an attentive audience of local men. "I tell you, Caraway's the guilty party," he declared, thumping the table for emphasis. Always did think himself superior with his musty law books. And I don't mind saying it, he was jealous of Lucy's attention. Saw them together once in the churchyard. She laughed at something he said. A girl like her, she'd never look at him seriously, of course, but he's the type to resent a slight. His companions nodded, half convinced. But one, old Mr. Turner, cleared his throat cautiously. "Begging your pardon, Captain, but folks say it was you as quarreled with her in the lane." Captain Fenton flushed a deep red. Nonsense. A mere misunderstanding. Young people need firm words now and then. I was merely warning her about keeping company with Dr. Leslie too freely. No harm in that. But his vehemence did little to convince. The suspicion, once spoken, clung to him like burrs to a coat. Meanwhile, Miss Marple continued her quiet perambulations through the Penivamif, and Fess and Marple continued her quiet perambulations through the Fensinus village. To each encounter she brought her mild smile, her sympathetic ear, her air of harmless curiosity. And people, finding themselves listened to with such gentleness, spoke more freely than they intended. From Mrs. Drayton she heard a sharp remark about Lucy's ambitions, which, Miss Marple gleaned, had involved more than one gentleman in Brindleford. From Mrs. Fenton she caught a nervous allusion to her husband's temper. "He means no harm, of course," Mrs. Fenton insisted, twisting her gloves. "But you know how he is. Quick words, quick hands. People do not always understand him." And from young Tom, the vicar's nephew, she learned something else entirely. "I saw Lucy near the river, just before the fete," he blurted, his eyes wide. "She was talking to Dr. Leslie. They looked serious. Then she cried, 'I'm sure she did,' and ran off. But don't tell anyone I said so, miss." Miss Marple promised gently. But in her mind, the pieces shifted into a new pattern. Inspector Graves, however, remained firm in his conviction. He paid a second visit to Caraway's house, demanding explanations for every hour of his day. Caraway, growing irritable, provided them in clipped tones. He had been at home reading until the fete, he said. He had spoken to Lucy only in passing. "Reading, eh?" Graves said, skeptically. "No witnesses, of course." Caraway's mouth tightened. "I have lived alone for 30 years, Inspector. I do not keep a nurse to observe me. You may make of that what you will." To Graves, this had the ring of guilt. To Miss Marple, hearing of it later from Mrs. Bantry, it had the ring of irritation, which was not quite the same thing. The real revelations, however, came not from the men of Brindleford, but from its women. In the tea shop the following afternoon, Miss Marple sat unobtrusively at a corner table, sipping weak Earl Grey. Nearby, Mrs. Price, Mrs. Drayton, and Mrs. Ellis, the organist's wife, bent their heads together in eager conversation. "It's clear as day," Mrs. Price was saying. "Lucy set her cap at Dr. Leslie, and he, poor man, was taken in. But then what of Captain Fenton? He won't have his authority undermined. That's why they quarreled. Authority," sniffed Mrs. Drayton. "It's jealousy, pure and simple. Fenton cannot bear the thought of Lucy preferring another man. And let us not forget his wife. Poor soul, what she must endure. I've always said, where there is jealousy, there is danger." Mrs. Ellis, quieter than the others, spoke up suddenly. "There's talk of money, too. I heard Lucy will inherit a tidy sum from her godmother. That might tempt some, mightn't it?" At this, Mrs. Price and Mrs. Drayton exchanged wide-eyed looks. Money, of course, was a motive that even the most respectable villagers could understand. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her eyes half closed. To anyone watching, she appeared to be dozing. But every word was carefully noted, each placed in its proper pigeonhole in her orderly mind. That evening, Mrs. Bantry pressed her for her opinion. "Jane, who do you suspect? You must have some idea. Do you think it's Captain Fenton, or Mrs. Drayton, or even the doctor himself?" Miss Marple smiled. "One must not rush, Dolly. Suspicion is a dangerous thing. It clouds the mind. Better to watch and wait. In time, the truth will reveal itself, often in the smallest, most trivial detail." She bent to her knitting once more, the soft click of needles punctuating the quiet. But Brindleford was not quiet. Beneath its orderly facades, tensions grew sharper. Lucy Armitage, though recovering, now walked the lanes with a subdued expression. The doctor's attentions to her became more marked, provoking speculation and, in some quarters, resentment. Captain Fenton grew more blustery by the day, his wife more withdrawn. Henry Carroway kept to himself, glaring at passers-by, which only fueled the villagers' certainty of his guilt. And Miss Marple, gentle, elderly, apparently absorbed in her knitting, saw it all. She saw the half-hidden looks, the suppressed emotions, the quick flushes and sudden silences. To her experienced eye, Brindleford was no longer a peaceful village but a stage, where human passions played out beneath a veil of propriety. The air in Brindleford seemed heavier in the days that followed. Summer sunlight still lay across the cottages, roses still nodded on trellises, but there was a nervousness beneath the village calm, as though people spoke in lowered tones and glanced too often over their shoulders. Inspector Graves, satisfied with his conclusion, carried himself with a renewed importance. "We've got our man under watch," he announced at the King's Arms. "No need for further fuss. Carroway will be taught a lesson, and the rest of you may mind your own business." But Brindleford was not convinced. Carroway's sour expression behind his lace-curtained windows did not look to them like guilt. It looked like resentment. And resentment, to a village mind, was almost as dangerous. Miss Marple, however, remained serene. She sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room, her knitting needles moving steadily, her eyes resting on the window where the shadows of evening lengthened. She had the air of a woman waiting, though for what, no one could have guessed. It was on the third evening after Lucy's collapse that the second shock came. The Fentons lived in a modest Georgian house on the edge of the village. Its neat lawn and clipped hedge gave no hint of the storm within. But at 9:30, villagers were startled by the clanging of the church bell, rung furiously by young Tom, the vicar's nephew. Breathless, he shouted the news through the gathering crowd. "Captain Fenton, he's been shot." Within minutes, the narrow lane was choked with villagers. Lamps flickered in windows, slippers scuffed on cobblestones, voices rose in disbelief. Inside the Fenton house, confusion reigned. Captain Fenton lay slumped in his armchair, his face pale, his shirt front stained dark. Mrs. Fenton, trembling and white as chalk, sobbed uncontrollably in the corner. Dr. Leslie, summoned in haste, bent over the fallen man. "It is serious," he said grimly to Inspector Graves, who had arrived sweating and indignant. "A bullet lodged in the shoulder, not fatal if attended to, but close." "Enough. How the devil did it happen?" Graves demanded. Mrs. Fenton, wringing her hands, whispered, "He had just sat down with his evening paper. I was in the kitchen. Then I heard the shot. When I came in, he was like this." "And the weapon?" Graves barked. A servant produced a revolver lying discarded by the hearthrug. Graves picked it up gingerly. "His own, I suppose," he muttered. "Kept for show, like many ex-army men. Was there anyone else in the house?" "No, sir," said the servant, wide-eyed. "No one but us." Graves turned to Mrs. Fenton. "You're certain? No visitors, no callers?" Mrs. Fenton shook her head wildly. "No one." The news spread like wildfire. By morning, Every cottage, shop, and garden in Brindleford buzzed with speculation. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Price at the grocer's. "It was attempted murder. They failed with Lucy, so they tried with Captain Fenton. There's a hand behind all this, you'll see." Mrs. Drayton, meanwhile, insisted on another theory. It was his temper. He was always reckless. Likely cleaned the revolver carelessly, and it went off. Men like him never take proper care. Others were not so sure. Who had reason to harm Fenton? They asked. And why so soon after Lucy's collapse? Suspicion, once sown, grew thickly. Some said Lucy herself might have borne a grudge against Fenton for his public scolding. Others hinted at financial quarrels. Still others murmured about Mrs. Fenton, pale, timid, cowed. Might she have at last struck back against her overbearing husband? Miss Marple listened to it all with her usual calm. Sitting in the vicarage garden that afternoon, she appeared to be counting stitches, but in truth she was counting motives. Captain Fenton had many enemies. His temper, once tolerated, had left bitterness in its wake. Yet Miss Marple's mind returned again and again to Mrs. Fenton's expression, not merely terror, but something quieter, deeper. A release, perhaps. Relief, even. She thought, too, of Lucy's collapse. Was it coincidence that two such incidents had occurred within days of one another? Or was there a pattern beneath the disorder? Inspector Graves, however, was jubilant. "This proves it, Collins," he declared. "Caraway again. He went after Lucy first, failed, and then turned his spite on Fenton. Clear as daylight." Sergeant Collins, though loyal, hesitated. "But, sir, Caraway was seen at home last night. Mrs. Miller swears she saw him through the window at the very hour the shot was fired." Graves scowled. "She may have been mistaken. Or he slipped out after. I'll not have villagers contradicting solid police work." So Caraway remained the inspector's quarry, though to Brindleford at large the picture was far less certain. At Mrs. Bantry's tea table the talk was franker still. "I never liked the way Captain Fenton treated his wife," said Mrs. Bantry, shaking her head. "Always snapping, always belittling. Poor soul, she's endured more than enough. I dare say she could have snatched up the revolver herself." Miss Marple, pouring cream with steady hand, said mildly, "It is always possible, Dolly. Wives are more often driven to desperate measures than is sometimes supposed. But desperation leaves traces, and I saw no such traces upon Mrs. Fenton." "What did you see, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled. "A woman who was frightened, yes. But frightened of what or whom? That is the question." Later that evening, as she walked back from the churchyard, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Leslie. His brow was furrowed, his manner distracted. "Miss Marple," he said abruptly, "you were at the fete. You saw Lucy collapse. Do you think it was truly the sun?" She looked at him calmly. "What do you think, doctor?" He hesitated. "I cannot dismiss the possibility of interference. There was bitterness on her tongue. She told me so. A draught in her tea, perhaps. And now this business with Fenton." He broke off, shaking his head. "It does not fit together. Unless, Miss Marple finished softly, the same hand lies behind both." Dr. Leslie looked startled, then thoughtful. "You believe that?" "I believe," said Miss Marple gently, "that human nature is much the same in Brindleford as in St. Mary Mead or anywhere else. When people quarrel, when tempers flare, when jealousies fester, one must not be surprised at what follows." The young doctor was silent, troubled. Miss Marple walked on, her small figure erect against the twilight. By the week's end, Brindleford was divided. Half the village still believed Caraway guilty. The other half whispered of Mrs. Fenton, or even Lucy herself. And beneath it all, unease grew, unease that something dark was stirring. beneath their tranquil hedgerows and tidy gardens. Miss Marple, quietly knitting, said nothing. But she knew this much. The pattern was forming, and the next row of stitches would reveal more than anyone in Brindleford cared to imagine. Generate 8 pictures from key scenes of this chapter, and generate their full prompt size of each picture should be 16:9. The Fenton shooting had left Brindleford unsettled. Though Captain Fenton survived, lying now under the care of Dr. Leslie with his arm heavily bandaged, the sense of safety in the village had gone. 2 incidents, so close together, could not be dismissed as chance. Behind closed doors, villagers whispered the same question: who in Brindleford was dangerous? Inspector Graves continued to proclaim his certainty. Caraway, he insisted, was behind it all. A sour man, a solitary man, and clever with poisons too, he declared in the King's Arms, ignoring the fact that Caraway had no experience with chemistry beyond drafting the occasional will. But outside the inn, suspicion turned in other directions. Each villager, prompted by old grievances and sharpened tongues, seemed ready to point the finger at a neighbor. It was Mrs. Price who first raised the subject of money. Meeting Miss Marple at the churchyard gate, she lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. "They say Lucy's to inherit nearly £2,000 from her godmother, Miss Trent of Marleycombe. The will's been signed, sealed, and waiting only on the old lady's passing. £2,000. A fortune in these times." Miss Marple raised her brows mildly. "Indeed, that is not inconsiderable." "And you know what money does to people," Mrs. Price continued, her eyes sharp. "Dr. Leslie may be a fine young man, but he's not rich. A girl like Lucy, she might be tempted to use her inheritance to catch him, or perhaps he himself." Miss Marple stopped her with a gentle shake of the head. "My dear, young men do not fall in love for money only, and yet money does alter the picture, does it not?" Later that same day, Mrs. Bantry bustled in with a piece of news even juicier. "Jane, you won't believe it, but I heard from my maid, who had it from the grocer's boy, that Mrs. Fenton has been seen more than once in Dr. Leslie's company without her husband." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Ah, such things are seldom secret in a village. Did Captain Fenton know, do you think?" Mrs. Bantry flushed with the excitement of scandal. "If he didn't, he does now. And perhaps that explains his quarrel with Lucy too. You see, Jane, if Mrs. Fenton had been fond of Dr. Leslie and Lucy turned her eyes in the same direction, well, that would be enough to rouse any man's temper." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked serenely. "Love triangles," she said softly. "Yes, they are often the sharpest of motives, and they leave behind much bitterness." The following morning brought yet another revelation. At the post office, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Ellis, the organist's wife, telling Mrs. Drayton of Captain Fenton's debts. "They say he borrowed heavily from a moneylender in Marleycombe," Mrs. Ellis confided. "And worse, he put up his wife's small income as security. If he were to die, she would be ruined. Unless, of course, she inherited his small estate quickly. It makes one wonder." Mrs. Drayton pursed her lips. "It makes one wonder about a great many things, Mrs. Ellis. For instance, who loaded that revolver? He never did so himself, I'm sure, and yet there it was, ready and waiting." Her meaning was plain. Mrs. Fenton, pale and timid, might have prepared her husband's weapon in advance. Miss Marple, walking home, reflected on all she had heard. Money, jealousy, betrayal, they were threads she had seen in many villages before. Each villager saw only a fragment, but to her experienced mind, the fragments formed a pattern. She remembered Mrs. Fenton's expression the night of the shooting. Not grief, not shock, but something quieter, deeper, relief. A woman long oppressed, perhaps, glimpsing the chance of freedom. Yet her hands had shaken too violently, her voice too faltered, for Miss Marple to believe she had fired the revolver herself. If Mrs. Fenton had indeed wished her husband dead, someone else had acted for her or seized upon the same thought for their own ends. Meanwhile, Lucy Armitage herself became the subject of whispers. Some villagers pitied her, others condemned. Mrs. Price, with grim satisfaction, declared, "I've always said she was too proud. Flirting with Caraway, leading the doctor on, quarreling with Fenton. Now see the trouble she's brought upon us all. It's young women like her that set men at each other's throats." Lucy, hearing of these remarks, wept in private, but Dr. Leslie defended her stoutly. "She has been through enough," he said firmly to anyone who questioned. "Leave her alone." His chivalry did little to calm the village. In fact, it only sharpened tongues further. For now there was talk of an engagement, whispered, uncertain, but growing stronger each day. Inspector Graves, oblivious to these undercurrents, pressed on with his pursuit of Caraway. "We found the chemist sold him arsenic last year," he announced triumphantly to Sergeant Collins. Collins looked doubtful. "He said it was for clearing weeds from his garden." "An old excuse," Graves said firmly. "Once a man starts with arsenic, who knows where it ends?" But Miss Marple, upon hearing this, merely smiled. "Arsenic for weeds is common enough, Inspector. More common, I should say, than arsenic in teacups. Still, it is interesting, very interesting indeed." That Sunday, the villagers gathered at church with a sense of unease. Captain Fenton, confined to bed, was absent. Lucy, pale but dignified, sang the hymns with her usual sweetness. Dr. Leslie kept a watchful eye upon her. Mrs. Fenton sat in her pew like a ghost, her hands clasped tightly together. Henry Caraway entered last, head high, ignoring the whispers that followed him. Miss Marple observed them all, her gaze gentle, her thoughts far sharper. She noted the way Mrs. Fenton's eyes flickered toward Lucy, not with sympathy but with something darker. She noted the stiffness with which Caraway greeted the doctor, and the doctor's quick glance at Lucy when her voice trembled on a hymn verse. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was always most revealing in church. No one could quite conceal their true feelings under the weight of hymns and prayers. That evening, over supper, Mrs. Bantry pressed her again. "Jane, what do you think? Is it Caraway, as the inspector says? Or Mrs. Fenton, with her poor nerves? Or perhaps Lucy, slyer than she seems?" Miss Marple laid down her knife and fork. "My dear, I think only this, that people rarely commit crimes without cause, and in Brindleford there are causes enough. Jealousy, money, pride, resentment. They are all here, simmering beneath the roses and the tea tables. The question is not whether someone had motive, but which of them had the opportunity. And that, Dolly, is what we must watch for." Her eyes twinkled as she reached for her knitting. "It is always the little things that betray us. A word spoken too quickly, a look at the wrong moment, a small detail overlooked. One must only be patient." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "You make it sound inevitable." Miss Marple smiled. "Human nature is inevitable, my dear, and sooner or later it will show its hand." Brindleford, that summer evening, lay quiet beneath the stars. But in its cottages and parlors, secrets pressed close against the silence. Lucy dreamed uneasily of dark hands and bitter tea. Mrs. Fenton stared at her husband's empty chair with unreadable eyes. Captain Fenton, restless in his bed, muttered curses even in sleep. Caraway turned in his lonely house, nursing grievances. And Miss Marple, in her neat guest room at the Bantrys, laid her knitting carefully beside her bed. She closed her eyes, but her mind remained wakeful. For she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that Brindleford's secrets were not finished yet, and that the next revelation would bring the truth one step closer. Inspector Graves prided himself on being a man of action. Decisive, he liked to say. That's the word. No use in pussyfooting about, and so, on the Wednesday following the shooting of Captain Fenton, he decided to end the matter once and for all. Henry Carroway, he declared to Sergeant Collins, is our man. We've coddled him long enough. He poisoned Lucy's tea, he loaded Fenton's revolver, and he'll answer for it. Collins, who had doubts he dared not voice too loudly, asked, "But, sir, the evidence?" Graves puffed out his chest. "We have motive. The man's a misanthrope, embittered by years of solitude. We have opportunity. He served tea at the fete. He lives close enough to slip into the Fenton house. And we have character, secretive, irritable, eccentric. The village expects justice, Collins, and they shall have it." And with that, Graves set off to Carroway's neat little house at the end of Willow Lane. The arrest itself was swift, though not without drama. Villagers, alerted by the sight of the inspector striding purposefully with his sergeant, gathered at cottage gates and along hedgerows. Carroway, summoned from his study, appeared in the doorway with his usual stiff manner. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he demanded. "Henry Carroway," said Graves in a ringing tone, "I must ask you to accompany." "For weeds," Carroway snapped. "And you were seen near the Fenton house on the very evening of the shooting." "I was in my garden," Carroway retorted. "Mrs. Miller saw me through the hedge." But his protests were drowned in the murmurs of the crowd. Villagers had long disliked Carroway's aloofness. Now they saw in it confirmation of evil. Sergeant Collins, a little pale, laid a hand on Carroway's shoulder. "Best come quietly, sir." And so Henry Carroway, once a respected solicitor, was led away under the watchful eyes of Brindleford. That evening the village hummed with satisfaction. At last the culprit was caught. At the grocer's, at the tea shop, at the vicarage gate, the refrain was the same. "I always said he was peculiar. Never trusted him. Too clever for his own good, and cleverness leads to wickedness." Even Mrs. Bantry, though softer of heart, admitted to Miss Marple as they sat with their knitting, "Well, Jane, it does seem to fit. He had the chance, and everyone says he bore grudges. Perhaps the inspector is right after Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly above her needles. "Perhaps, Dolly. Yet I have noticed that when everyone agrees too quickly, the truth is often otherwise." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "But what about the arsenic, and the quarrels, and his queer manner?" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "arsenic is very often purchased for weeds. Quarrels are plentiful in any village. And as for manner, well, some people are born brusque. It is not in itself proof of wickedness." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "You always make me doubt the simple answers." "That," said Miss Marple mildly, "is because the simple answers are very seldom true." The following day, Inspector Graves strutted about Brindleford like a rooster in his yard. He assured everyone who asked that Carroway would be remanded for trial and that the Crown's case will be straightforward. But there was one man who was not satisfied. Dr. Leslie, encountering Miss Marple in the lane, stopped abruptly. "Miss Marple, you don't believe it's Carroway, do you?" She smiled. "Why do you ask, Doctor?" "Because it doesn't make sense. Lucy swears she hardly spoke to him at the fete. And Fenton, well, he had a dozen enemies more likely than Carroway. The man may be surly, but he isn't dangerous." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You are observant, Doctor. It is always wise to question what does not make sense." Meanwhile, Mrs. Fenton lived in a state of nervous collapse. She wept when neighbors called, wrung her hands, spoke of her husband's suffering. Yet Miss Marple, watching quietly, observed again that odd undercurrent of relief. Mrs. Fenton seemed almost lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. Lucy Armitage, too, behaved strangely. though she expressed indignation at Carraway's arrest. Miss Marple detected something evasive in her eyes when the subject was raised. Was it guilt? Or fear? Captain Fenton himself, though confined to bed, thundered loudly against Carraway. Villainous fellow, always against me. I'll see him hanged for it, mark my words. His voice, hoarse but strong, carried down the corridor. Miss Marple, listening from the parlor where she sat with Mrs. Bantry, merely shook her head. He is too vehement, Dolly. People who know the truth seldom shout so loudly. That night, another whisper ran through Brindleford. Old Mr. Turner, the shepherd, claimed he had seen a shadowy figure near the vicarage on the night of the shooting, a figure too slight, too delicate, to be Carraway. When pressed, he shook his head. Might have been a woman, he muttered, or a young girl. Couldn't be sure in the dark. This hint, though vague, spread quickly. Suddenly tongues wagged anew. Could it have been Mrs. Fenton, or Lucy herself? Inspector Graves dismissed the rumor angrily. Old Turner sees shapes in the hedges after dark. Pay no mind to him. Carraway's our man. But Miss Marple, hearing of it, thought otherwise. Old men, she reflected, often saw more than they were given credit for. 2 days later, an incident occurred that shifted everything. The vicar's maid, tidying the church vestry, found a small glass vial hidden behind a stack of hymnals. It contained traces of a white powder. At once the gossip flared again. Poison! Proof at last! And naturally it must belong to Carraway. Had he not once borrowed a hymn book? Did he not often linger after service? Inspector Graves was jubilant. This clinches it. He hid the poison in the vestry, waiting his chance. The case is watertight. But when Miss Marple examined the vial with delicate fingers, she murmured, "So convenient. Much too convenient, I think." "Do you mean it was planted?" asked Mrs. Bantry, wide-eyed. Miss Marple smiled. "It has been my experience, Dolly, that when evidence appears too neatly, it is very often placed where it will be found." And so, while the village congratulated itself on its keen judgment and Inspector Graves polished his case, Miss Marple knitted quietly in her chair. Her mind, sharp beneath the gentle exterior, worked steadily at the puzzle. She saw now that Carraway was not the villain but the scapegoat. Someone else in Brindleford, clever and patient, had taken advantage of his surly reputation. Someone who understood that the village would leap to accuse the solitary man. The pattern, faint but unmistakable, was beginning to emerge. "Dolly," she said softly that evening, "I think we must prepare ourselves, for I do not believe the danger in Brindleford is over. On the contrary, I think it has only just begun. The arrest of Henry Carraway might have quieted a lesser village, but Brindleford, with its clipped hedges and lace curtains, was not easily subdued. Whispers multiplied, and behind those whispers lay the sort of secrets that rarely reach daylight until a crisis brings them bubbling to the surface. The first secret came from Mrs. Drayton. It was she who told Mrs. Bantry, and through her, Miss Marple, of a matter that had long been known in certain circles but never spoken aloud. Lucy Armitage, Mrs. Drayton said grimly over the counter at the grocer's, was far too friendly with Captain Fenton. My son saw them walking together more than once, and not always at respectable hours. A girl of her station ought to have known better. I warned her. Yes, I did. And now you see the result." Mrs. Bantry, repeating this to Miss Marple later, half apologized. "Of course, Jane, it may be an exaggeration, but Mrs. Drayton was most insistent. She says Lucy led him on." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Ah, and if Mrs. Fenton knew or suspected?" The two ladies exchanged a glance. In the silence that followed, the soft ticking of the mantel clock seemed very loud. The second secret emerged quite by chance. Old Mr. Turner, the shepherd, paused Miss Marple on the lane one afternoon. He tugged his cap respectfully and leaned closer. "Beg pardon, miss," he said, "but I thought you ought to know. I've seen the captain playing cards in Marleycombe. High stakes they were. And owing money he couldn't pay. Dangerous business, gambling. Men get desperate." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That is most useful to know, Mr. Turner. Thank you kindly." As he shuffled away, she considered. Gambling debts could explain a great many things. Quarrels with Caraway over loans, perhaps, or the sudden desperate need to press his wife's allowance into security. But it was Mrs. Fenton who, without meaning to, revealed perhaps the most poignant truth. Miss Marple found her in the vicarage garden one morning, pale and trembling, clasping a handkerchief in nervous fingers. "My husband is recovering," Mrs. Fenton said faintly. "They say he will soon be himself again." She paused, then added in a voice so low it was almost a fallet, was almost a muste whisper, "God help me, Miss Marple, I almost wish he would not." Miss Marple regarded her with grave kindness. "My dear, you have suffered long, have you not?" Tears spilled over. "He was never kind, not once, in all our years. Always his temper, his suspicions, his demands. I bore it because I must. But if she were in his thoughts as well, then I was doubly humiliated." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "Such burdens are heavy. Yet it is not always the burdened who act, but those who see an advantage in their sorrow." Mrs. Fenton looked up, startled, as though Miss Marple had touched too nearly upon the truth. Meanwhile, Lucy herself was at the center of new gossip. Mrs. Price, bustling into the post office, confided to anyone who would listen that Lucy had once been secretly engaged, not to Dr. Leslie, as everyone supposed, but to a young officer who had died abroad. "She wears his locket still," Mrs. Price whispered dramatically. "But of course, she pretends it is nothing. Sentimental girl. Always entangling men about her." Whether the story was true or embroidered mattered little. By the end of the day, half the village believed Lucy carried tragic secrets, and the other half believed she was a schemer. Dr. Leslie, however, stood firm in his defense. "Lucy has been treated abominably," he told Miss Marple one afternoon when they met in the lane. "If she had secrets, they were her own to bear. But she is not deceitful, whatever they say." Miss Marple's expression was kind, but she said nothing. She had seen too many young men blinded by loyalty to accept words at face value. Perhaps the most curious revelation came from an unexpected source. The vicar's maid, a girl of 17, sidled up to Miss Marple shyly after service. "Please, miss, I thought you ought to know. I saw Mrs. Drayton in the vestry last week after choir practice. She was looking about as if she wanted something hidden, and when she saw me, she started and told me sharp to run along." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "That is very good of you to tell me, my dear." The maid flushed, pleased at being taken seriously. Later, Miss Marple reflected that the mysterious vial found in the vestry might not have been Caraway's at all. Convenient evidence planted in a convenient place. And who had motive to plant it? Someone eager to divert suspicion. The pattern was becoming clearer, though far from complete. Miss Marple sat by the Bantry's fire that evening, knitting with serene patience, while Mrs. Bantry listed the rumors she had heard that day. "There's Lucy and the captain. Perhaps an affair, perhaps not. There's Mrs. Fenton's misery, poor soul. There are the captain's debts. And there's Dr. Leslie, who seems very fond of Lucy indeed. And of course Mrs. Drayton, always. Stirring. It's a tangle, Jane. How does one make sense of it all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, it is always a tangle until the strands are laid straight. One must not rush. But I will tell you this. In every case I have known, there are secrets. some trivial, some grave. But the true crime is seldom hidden among the trivial ones. It is hidden, instead, where no one dares to look. Mrs. Bantry shivered with delicious anticipation. That night, in her neat guest room, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and looked out of the window. The moon shone pale over Brindleford, silvering the hedgerows and glinting on the river. Peaceful, one might have said, but peace was deceptive. Beneath the tranquility of Brindleford lay jealousy, pride, betrayal, and fear. Lucy, in her cottage, clutched a locket to her chest and wept for a love long gone. Mrs. Fenton, beside her husband's sickbed, prayed for forgiveness for thoughts she could not suppress. Captain Fenton, restless even in pain, muttered dark words against his neighbors. Mrs. Drayton, in her tidy kitchen, stirred a pot of jam with unnecessary vigor. And Henry Carroway, alone in his confinement, stared at the ceiling with bitter eyes, protesting his innocence to the empty air. Each carried a secret, each bore a motive, and Miss Marple, lying down to rest, knew with certainty that until those secrets were fully exposed, the village would not be safe. For a few days after Henry Carroway's arrest, Brindleford tried to settle back into its rhythms. The butcher set out his cuts as usual, the vicar prepared Sunday's sermon, the women's committee met to discuss the autumn bazaar. Yet beneath the surface, unease lingered. Curtains twitched, voices hushed, and every villager carried the unspoken thought, what if it happens again? Miss Marple, however, was patient. Sitting at Mrs. Bantry's with her knitting, she remarked gently, one must never mistake the lull for the end of the storm. It is often only the eye, and the storm's return may be the fiercer for the pause. Mrs. Bantry shivered and begged her not to speak so prophetically. But Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. The storm returned on Thursday evening. Lucy Armitage, still pale but stronger, had been persuaded by Dr. Leslie to take a walk by the river. They were seen strolling near the willow trees, speaking earnestly. Several villagers, looking out from their gardens, noted the doctor's attentive air and Lucy's lowered head. Mrs. Price, who never missed a chance to comment, whispered later that she looked like a girl confessing her sins. They did not return by dusk. At first, no one thought much of it. The pair might have walked as far as Marleycombe. But when darkness fell and still there was no sign of them, concern stirred. By 10 o'clock, Dr. Leslie was discovered staggering into the King's Arms, his coat disheveled, his face bloodied. "She's gone," he gasped. "Lucy, someone struck me down, she's gone." The village erupted into panic. Within the hour, lanterns bobbed along the lanes as half of Brindleford turned out to search. The inspector, roused from his supper, hurried to the river bank, red-faced and blustering. Miss Marple, summoned by Mrs. Bantry, insisted on going too, her step slow but steady. At the water's edge they found signs of a struggle, a trampled patch of grass, a handkerchief torn and muddied, and near the bank a footprint, small, delicate, unmistakably feminine. "She was dragged," Dr. Leslie insisted, clutching his bruised head. A shadow sprang out from behind the willow, struck me with something heavy. When I came to, Lucy was gone. Inspector Graves growled. Carroway's work again. Escaped his confinement, no doubt. Villainous fellow. But Miss Marple bent to examine the footprint. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed." The search continued into the night. Villagers fanned out across fields and hedgerows, calling Lucy's name, lanterns flickering in the dark. At last, near dawn, she was found, dazed but alive, lying on a mossy bank half a mile, downstream. Her dress was torn, her hair tumbled, but she was conscious enough to whisper, I don't know what happened. I felt a hand at my throat, then nothing." She was carried back to the vicarage, where Dr. Leslie tended her with trembling hands. Captain Fenton, pale and furious, raged from his sickbed. "The girl will bring ruin to us all," he thundered, ignoring his wife's attempts to calm him. Mrs. Drayton had another view. Mark my words, it was jealousy. Lucy's always set men against each other. The doctor, the captain, even poor Caraway. One of them turned on her. It must be so. By tea time, the story had grown more lurid still. Some swore Lucy had run away deliberately, only to lose her courage. Others hinted darkly at blackmail. The truth was lost in the noise. Miss Marple, however, spent the day in quiet reflection. She visited the river bank, leaning on her stick, studying the trampled grass and broken branches. She bent to examine the footprint once more. It was small, yes, but oddly placed. The toes pointed not toward the water as one might expect, but away from it into the trees. Later, she questioned Dr. Leslie gently. "You are quite sure you were struck from behind, Doctor?" "Yes, Miss Marple. I heard nothing, saw nothing until the blow came." "And Lucy, she was beside you all the time?" He hesitated. "For most of the walk, yes, but at the last she seemed agitated. She moved ahead of me, perhaps 20 paces. I followed, and then—" his hand went to his bandaged temple. Miss Marple nodded. "Agitated, you say?" "Yes, I thought as much." That evening, Mrs. Fenton sent word asking Miss Marple to call. She received her in a small, dimly lit sitting room, the curtains drawn tight. "My husband is furious," Mrs. Fenton whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "He says Lucy is bringing disgrace upon us all. He swears she provoked this attack herself. But, Miss Marple, I cannot help but think someone wishes her truly gone." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Do you fear for Lucy or for yourself?" Mrs. Fenton trembled. "Both. Oh, Miss Marple, if only you knew, there are things in this house, things I dare not speak." Her words trailed off as footsteps sounded in the hall. Captain Fenton's voice, loud and angry, echoed. "Who is there? What are you whispering about?" Mrs. Fenton flinched, and Miss Marple rose with quiet dignity. "Another time, perhaps," she said kindly. The inspector, meanwhile, blustered on. "Proof, that's what we need," he declared in the inn parlor. "Caraway's guilt is plain, but the law requires evidence. Well, this second attack will clinch it. We'll find his tracks yet." But privately, Sergeant Collins approached Miss Marple. "Between ourselves? Ma'am, I'm not so sure. Caraway's locked fast enough, and still this happens. Do you think—" he hesitated. "Do you think the inspector's wrong?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think, Sergeant, that truth is seldom found where one looks first. But it leaves traces, always traces. We must be patient and watchful." By the week's end, Lucy had recovered enough to speak. She lay in bed at the vicarage, pale but resolute, while Miss Marple sat quietly beside her. "Do you remember anything, my dear?" the old lady asked softly. Lucy frowned. "I remember fear and a voice." "Yes, a voice whispering, but I cannot recall the words." "A man's voice? Or a woman's?" Lucy hesitated. "It was low, urgent. It could have been either." She pressed her hands to her eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple, I am so tired of secrets. Everyone looks at me as though I am to blame. Perhaps I am." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You are to blame for nothing, my dear, except, perhaps, for being young and pretty in a world where both can be dangerous." Lucy wept quietly, and Miss Marple's eyes, though kind, were grave. That night, in the Bantrys' drawing-room, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and spoke at last. "Dolly, I am convinced of this. Henry Caraway is innocent. The second incident proves it. Whoever struck Dr. Leslie and carried off Lucy is still among us, clever, ruthless, and determined. We must be very careful indeed." Mrs. Bantry shuddered. "But who, Jane? Who?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "That, my dear, is what we must discover, and if I am not mistaken, the culprit will soon make another move. Such people cannot help themselves. They always go too far." She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly. Outside, Brindleford lay silent beneath the stars, but within its quiet cottages, fear and suspicion stirred like a restless wind.
Brindleford awoke after the second incident like a village with fever. Housewives gathered at garden gates, men lingered too long in the inn, and every lane hummed with theories. To some, the attack proved Carraway's guilt beyond doubt. "He must have escaped," Mrs. Price insisted. "Don't tell me otherwise. The man has the look of a fiend." Others whispered that the matter was darker still. "No prisoner could have been in two places at once," muttered Mr. Turner, shaking his head. "Mark my words, there's more than one hand in this." In the Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple sat in her customary chair, knitting needles flashing in the morning light. Mrs. Bantry, who had just returned from the post office, sank into a seat with the air of one weighted down by news. "Jane, the village is quite beside itself. Some are ready to march to the jail and demand Carraway's release, while others want him hanged at once. And poor Lucy. They say she lies half in tears, half in shame. One cannot help pitying the girl." Miss Marple looked up serenely. "Pity is often deserved, Dolly, but it can also cloud judgment. We must distinguish between what people feel about Lucy and what truly befell her." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "But how, Jane? Everyone says something different." "That," said Miss Marple with her faint smile, "is the very point. Everyone sees from their own angle. And when one compares those angles, the outline of truth may be traced." Later that day, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, pausing at each house and gate with the air of an old lady enjoying the sunshine. But her eyes, behind their mildness, missed nothing. At the vicarage, she found Lucy in bed, pale but restless, with Dr. Leslie beside her. He rose when Miss Marple entered, bowing courteously, though weariness showed in his face. "She is recovering," he said softly, "but the shock has been severe." Lucy, reaching out a hand, whispered, "I heard the voice again, Miss Marple. I tried to remember. It was low, insistent. It said, 'Keep silent, or you'll regret it.'" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "That is very useful, my dear. Very useful indeed." When Lucy drifted into sleep, Miss Marple turned to the doctor. "Tell me, Dr. Leslie, who knew you would be walking by the river with her that evening?" He hesitated. "We met in the village before we set out. A number of people saw us. Mrs. Price, Mrs. Drayton, perhaps others." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Such things are seldom secret, and whoever planned an attack would have needed to know you were there." On her way back, she encountered Mrs. Drayton outside her gate, fussing with her roses. "A dreadful business," Mrs. Drayton said at once. "The poor girl, but I can't say I'm surprised. These things follow when young women encourage too much attention. Mark my words, it will end in worse before long." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. "And what do you think of Mr. Carraway's arrest, Mrs. Drayton?" "Quite right," the woman declared firmly. "I never trusted him, always lurking about. And now this business of poison found in the vestry. Why, who else could it belong to?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, it is very convenient evidence, is it not?" Mrs. Drayton flushed, bending quickly to snip at a rose. That afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea with Mrs. Fenton. The little parlour was subdued, curtains half drawn, a faint smell of lavender in the air. Mrs. Fenton herself poured tea with trembling hands. "My husband grows stronger each day," she said faintly. "He is already demanding to see Lucy, to confront her. I dread what may happen." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "You are afraid of him still, my dear." Mrs. Fenton looked down, twisting her napkin. "He has never been easy. His anger, it is a terrible thing. And if he believed Lucy slighted him, or preferred another—" She broke off, shivering. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Tell me truly, do you believe he could have harmed her?" Mrs. Fenton's lips trembled. "Once I should have said no, but now I cannot be sure." Her honesty struck Miss Marple more forcibly than any denial. She saw in the woman's eyes not guilt, but long-suppressed fear, the kind that warps and weakens, but rarely kills. At twilight, Miss Marple paused by the churchyard, where she found Sergeant Collins smoking a pipe. Unlike his superior, Collins had the wary air of a man who doubted official conclusions. "You don't believe it's Carraway, ma'am," he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled. "No, Sergeant. Do you?" He shook his head. "Not with him under lock and key when the second business happened. But try telling the inspector that." She studied him a moment. "You were one of the first at the river. Tell me, what struck you most?" "The handkerchief," he said at once. "It wasn't Lucy's, too coarse, like one of the gardener's cloths. But when I mentioned it, the inspector waved me off." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Such small things are never to be waved off, Sergeant. They are the very stitches of truth." That evening at the Bantry's, Miss Marple sat with her knitting while Mrs. Bantry fussed with papers. "Jane, what do you make of it all? Everyone has a secret, it seems. Captain Fenton's gambling, Mrs. Fenton's misery, Lucy's inheritance, Carraway's odd habits, Mrs. Drayton's spite. It's enough to fill 3 novels. Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, Dolly. But not all secrets lead to crime. Some are merely the foolishness of human nature. The difficulty lies in knowing which are deadly." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "And do you know?" Miss Marple paused, her needles poised. "I begin to suspect. Consider, Dolly. Lucy's inheritance, Captain Fenton's debts, Mrs. Fenton's despair, the doctor's attentions. Consider also the convenience of the vestry evidence, the too-ready conclusion about Carraway, the handkerchief that does not belong. Each piece alone tells little, but together—" She let the sentence trail off, her eyes twinkling. "Together what?" pressed Mrs. Bantry. "Together," said Miss Marple gently. "They suggest a hand that is clever, deliberate, and ruthless. A hand that understands human weakness and hides behind it." The next morning, news swept the village. Captain Fenton had insisted on being moved to the drawing room, where he might hold court once more. Visitors streamed to see him, and he thundered as loudly as ever, declaring that Lucy was a minx and Carraway a criminal. Miss Marple went also, sitting unobtrusively in a corner. She watched Mrs. Fenton hover like a shadow, flinching at her husband's every word. She saw Lucy arrive, pale and trembling, and the way Captain Fenton's eyes gleamed with a kind of cruel delight as he berated her. And she saw Dr. Leslie clench his hands until his knuckles whitened. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, laid bare in one room. Pride, fear, cruelty, pity. And somewhere in it all, the pattern she sought. That night, as she folded her knitting away, she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, "The inspector is wrong, Dolly. Carraway is no more guilty than you or I. The true culprit is among those we see every day, smiling, speaking, playing their part. But soon, very soon, they will betray themselves. For wickedness cannot act without leaving a mark, and when it does, we must be ready." Mrs. Bantry shivered, though the fire was warm. "You make it sound as though something dreadful is still to come." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "My dear, in cases such as this, something dreadful almost always does."
The summer evening lay heavy over Brindleford. Bees droned in the lavender, and the river gleamed faintly gold in the last light, but the village was far from peaceful. Rumor had grown into obsession. Every knock at a door, every raised voice in the lane, every unfamiliar face was cause for alarm. Inspector Graves, stout and perspiring, assured all who asked that the culprit was in hand. "Caraway will hang," he declared at the King's Arms, raising his glass. "Mark me, it's settled." Yet even his sergeant looked doubtful. Miss Marple, sitting in Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room, continued to knit with her usual serenity. But her eyes, bright and sharp as the needles, missed nothing. She had heard enough now, enough whispers, enough contradictions, enough human frailty to form her conclusion. And quietly, politely, she began to act. That afternoon she walked to the churchyard, pausing at the vestry door. The place where the vial of powder had been found still troubled her. Too convenient, too staged. She looked about the shelves, the hymnals, the corners. Then she smiled faintly and left as if satisfied. By chance, though Miss Marple seldom believed in chance, Mrs. Drayton was nearby, gathering flowers for the altar. She started when she saw the old lady. "Good evening, Miss Marple. You startled me." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "I was only thinking how curious it was that anyone should hide a vial here. One wonders, don't you, who might have reason to do so?" Mrs. Drayton flushed. "Why, Caraway, of course. Who else?" Miss Marple looked at her gently. "Indeed. And yet, if one wished to accuse another, there could be no better place, could there?" For a moment Mrs. Drayton's scissors clattered against the stone sill. Then she laughed too loudly. "You have a suspicious mind, Miss Marple." Miss Marple only smiled, as though the matter were quite trivial. The next day, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Fenton. The little parlor smelled of medicine and stale tobacco, but Mrs. Fenton herself seemed changed. There was color in her cheeks and a strange light in her eyes. "My husband grows stronger," she said stiffly. "He insists he will resume his affairs at once." "I dread it, Miss Marple." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "You dread his temper, my dear. And yet you are freer now than you have ever been. People will say what they like, but one cannot always remain silent." Mrs. Fenton's eyes filled with tears. "If only I dared." She broke off as heavy footsteps sounded above. The captain was awake, and his voice thundered through the ceiling, calling her name. She rose hurriedly, but not before Miss Marple had seen the flicker of hatred in her expression. Hatred was a dangerous thing, Miss Marple reflected, yet hatred did not always find its outlet in action. Later that evening, Dr. Leslie came to the Bantrys for supper. His face was drawn, his manner distracted. "Miss Marple," he burst out at last, "it cannot be Caraway. The evidence is flimsy, ridiculous, and yet the inspector will not listen. Lucy is terrified, Mrs. Fenton near collapse, and the whole village turned inside out. Something must be done." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "You are very protective of Lucy," he colored. "She is innocent, too innocent to be caught in all this." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Innocence, doctor, is a matter of appearance as much as fact. But I agree with you on one point. Caraway is not the guilty party." He stared. "Then who?" Miss Marple held up a hand. "Patience, doctor. To accuse without proof is folly. But sometimes proof may be coaxed into the open, if one provides the opportunity." And so Miss Marple set about creating opportunity. She began with the smallest of gestures, remarks made lightly in the hearing of those who mattered. At the tea shop she let slip that Lucy remembered a whisper at the river bank. At the post office she remarked that Captain Fenton's debts were common knowledge. At the churchyard she observed aloud that evidence, once planted, seldom stays hidden. Each phrase was mild, almost careless, but each was calculated. And gradually she saw the effect. Mrs. Drayton grew nervous, Mrs. Fenton more restless, Dr. Leslie pale and tense, Captain Fenton blustering too loudly. The village, already taut with suspicion, quivered like a net drawn tight. The decisive step came at Mrs. Bantry's suggestion of a small gathering. "Only a few neighbors," she said, "for tea and sponge. It will do us good to remember we are civilized people." Miss Marple agreed at once. "Yes, Dolly, invite them all. The Fentons, Lucy, Dr. Leslie, Mrs. Drayton, even Inspector Graves." "It will be most instructive." Mrs. Bantry stared. "Instructive, Jane? You sound as though you mean to hold an inquest in my drawing room." Miss Marple smiled. "Not quite an inquest, but perhaps a little conversation will tell us more than questions and jail cells have done." The gathering was arranged for the following Saturday. By 3 o'clock, the Bantry's drawing room was full of villagers balancing cups of tea and plates of sponge. Captain Fenton, pale but obstinate, sat like a wounded lion in his armchair, his wife hovering anxiously nearby. Lucy, looking fragile but determined, sat close to Dr. Leslie. Mrs. Drayton presided at the table with an air of importance, while Inspector Graves, mopping his brow, pronounced on police efficiency. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, seemed merely an old lady enjoying the company. Yet each word spoken, each glance exchanged, was carefully noted. At last she spoke. "It is curious, is it not, how accidents seldom come alone? First the fate, then the shooting, then the business by the river. One might almost think there was a plan behind it all." The room fell silent. Even Captain Fenton stopped muttering. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but clear, and one might wonder whose plan it was. Who stood to gain, who feared discovery, who sought to divert suspicion. The truth, I believe, is very close. Mrs. Drayton dropped her teacup with a clatter. Dr. Leslie went white. Mrs. Fenton gripped the back of a chair until her knuckles showed. Lucy herself gasped, then pressed her lips tightly together. Inspector Graves blustered, "Nonsense, Miss Marple." "We have our man." "Do we?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "I wonder." She let the silence stretch a moment longer, then smiled sweetly. "But forgive me, I grow fanciful. Another slice of sponge, perhaps?" When at last the guests departed, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend in awe. "Jane, what have you done?" They all looked ready to faint. Miss Marple folded her knitting serenely. "Merely a little test, Dolly. The guilty will reveal themselves when pressed. It is only a matter of time. And do you know who it is?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "I believe I do. But belief is not proof. And proof must be had if we are to save the innocent and unmask the guilty. For rest assured, Dolly, the danger in Brindleford is not yet over." She rose, slipping her knitting into its bag. "But soon, very soon, it will be." The Bantry's gathering lingered in every mind for days afterwards. Though Miss Marple had said nothing directly, her quiet words had hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Neighbors eyed each other with new suspicion, while the accused in whispers multiplied. Mrs. Price declared it must be Mrs. Fenton, for she looked white as death. Mrs. Drayton told the grocer that Miss Marple had meant Lucy all along. And in the King's Arms, Captain Fenton thundered that Caraway was guilty and Miss Marple a meddlesome old woman. Miss Marple, sitting serenely with her knitting, let the speculation boil. For she knew that pressure, once applied, often forced the truth into the open. And she had already decided how to apply that pressure more firmly. 2 days later, she asked Mrs. Bantry to arrange another gathering, this time smaller, more intimate. "Dolly, invite them again," she said. "Lucy, Dr. Leslie, Mrs. Fenton, Mrs. Drayton, and of course the captain. Tell Inspector Graves it is only a friendly supper, but say nothing of me." Mrs. Bantry stared. "Jane, what in the world are you about?" Miss Marple smiled. "Only watching human nature at play, my dear. And sometimes, when one watches long enough, the truth steps forward." That evening the guests arrived one by one. Lucy, pale but defiant, came on Dr. Leslie's arm. Mrs. Drayton swept in with forced briskness, though her hand shook as she removed her gloves. Mrs. Fenton appeared quiet, subdued, her eyes red as though from tears. Captain Fenton himself arrived with his walking stick, blustering loudly that he would not be coddled like an invalid. The supper began stiffly. Mrs. Bantry, nervous, pressed food upon them all, while conversation stumbled from one triviality to another. Inspector Graves ate heartily, declaring that justice would soon be seen. But when the meal ended and the party moved into the drawing-room, Miss Marple quietly slipped into her chair by the fire. She began softly, almost as if musing to herself. "It is curious, is it not," she said, "how one event so often leads to another. A girl collapses at a fete. A man is shot in his chair. Another girl vanishes by the river. At first they seem separate, yet slowly one perceives the same hand weaving through them all." A hush fell. Mrs. Drayton fiddled with her handkerchief. Lucy's fingers clutched at Dr. Leslie's sleeve. Mrs. Fenton's gaze darted toward her husband, who scowled at them all. "Caraway, of course," Graves exclaimed. "We've said it all along," Miss Marple smiled gently. "And yet Caraway was confined when the second incident occurred." "No, Inspector, the truth lies nearer at hand. It lies in the little things. The convenience of a vial found just where it would be discovered, the quarrels whispered about in lanes, the debts concealed, and the affections betrayed. Human nature, Inspector, is remarkably consistent. And when one sees enough examples of it, one learns to recognize the pattern." She let her words settle like stones in a pond. Captain Fenton struck his stick on the floor. "Speak plainly, woman. Do you mean to accuse me?" Miss Marple's gaze rested on him kindly. "No, Captain. You are blustering and cruel, perhaps, but you did not set these events in motion. Others may have wished you dead, but you are not the spider in this web." Fenton flushed darkly, half with anger, half with relief. Mrs. Drayton gave a sudden laugh. "Well then, if not him, it must be Lucy. She's the cause of it all, entangling men, flaunting herself." Lucy gasped, rising to her feet. "How dare you?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "Lucy has been foolish, but folly is not crime. No, Mrs. Drayton, the guilty party is cleverer than that. Too clever, in fact. For cleverness will often betray itself." Mrs. Drayton's face went scarlet. "You dare." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "You, Mrs. Drayton, have always disapproved of Lucy. You had reason, wounded pride through your son, and bitterness besides. But spite, though sharp, does not usually plot so carefully. You sought to slander her, yes, but you did not commit these deeds." Mrs. Drayton sank back in her chair, trembling. There was a pause. The air in the room was thick, charged, as though the very walls leaned in to listen. Miss Marple's voice grew softer still. "There remains but one person who had both cause and opportunity. A person overlooked, for they seem too timid, too quiet, too much in the background. Yet it is often such people who conceal the most. They know how to pass unseen, how to let others quarrel while they act in silence." All eyes turned slowly toward Mrs. Fenton. She gave a small cry, rising abruptly. "No, it is not true." Captain Fenton struggled to his feet, roaring. "Woman, what are you saying? Are you mad?" Mrs. Fenton's hands fluttered like trapped birds. "I bore it all, the anger, the humiliation, the debts. But when he turned to Lucy, when he flaunted it," her voice broke. "I thought if she were gone, he might return to me. And when he would not, when his cruelty grew worse, I thought—" Her words dissolved into sobs. Inspector Graves stared in disbelief. "You confess, madam? You poisoned Lucy? You loaded that revolver?" But Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not so quickly, Inspector. Listen carefully. She does not confess to the acts, but to the feelings. And it is feelings unguarded that reveal truth. Mrs. Fenton's sobs subsided into silence. She looked at Miss Marple with wide, fearful eyes as though begging for mercy. Miss Marple said quietly, "No, my dear, you did not do these things. But you spoke the thought aloud and someone else heard. Someone who saw in your misery the perfect mask for their own crime." The room drew a collective breath. Suspicion shifted as if a lantern had been turned, casting light into another corner. Miss Marple's eyes, kind but piercing, turned at last toward the person she had truly been watching all along. "You, my dear doctor," she said softly. "It was you." Dr. Leslie sprang to his feet, white as the tablecloth. "This is madness. How dare you?" But his protest rang too loudly, too desperate. In that instant, even the dullest villager present felt the truth ripple through the room. Lucy gave a faint cry. Captain Fenton swore. Mrs. Drayton gasped. And Mrs. Fenton, strangely, looked almost relieved. Miss Marple folded her knitting in her lap. "Yes," she said gently. "It is always the quiet, trusted ones we must watch most closely." The drawing-room erupted in confusion, accusations, denials, sobs, shouts. But Miss Marple sat calm amid the storm, the net now fully drawn. The guilty man had shown his hand, and soon, very soon, she would lay out the pattern for them all to see. The Bantry's drawing-room had dissolved into pandemonium. Captain Fenton thundered with outrage. Lucy wept openly. Mrs. Drayton declared she had always suspected something of the sort, and Inspector Graves shouted for silence, crimson in the face. But Miss Marple sat serenely in her chair, hands folded upon her knitting bag. Her quiet voice, when it came, was clear enough to still the room. "My dear friends, let us compose ourselves. There is no need for noise. The truth, I think, is plain, if we only look at it steadily." All eyes turned toward her. Dr. Leslie stood rigid, white-faced, his fists clenched at his sides. Mrs. Fenton clutched the back of her chair as though for support. The inspector mopped his brow furiously. Miss Marple began softly, as if speaking to children. "Consider first Lucy's collapse at the fete. The police, and many here, believed it a fainting fit or else some mischief by Mr. Carroway. Yet Lucy herself told me she tasted bitterness in her tea. And bitterness, as I know well from a dozen small domestic tragedies, is the unmistakable sign of poison, not in fatal dose, but in enough to alarm. Who poured that cup? Many did, perhaps. But one in particular had both opportunity and knowledge, Dr. Leslie. With his medical training, he knew precisely how much of a harmless but alarming draught might bring on collapse without killing. Why should he do such a thing? To create the impression that Lucy was delicate, vulnerable, in need of his constant care. It bound her to him with gratitude and fear. A murmur ran around the room. Lucy buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple continued. Next came the shooting of Captain Fenton. Here again, suspicion fell easily on Carroway or upon Mrs. Fenton, long-suffering wife. But let us look closer. The revolver was loaded, yet Captain Fenton never handled it himself. Who, then, had access? Mrs. Fenton, yes, but also the doctor who visited frequently under the guise of care. It is a simple matter to slip in a cartridge when examining a patient's drawer, or to leave the weapon where a hand would naturally grasp it. And why should Dr. Leslie wish the captain harmed? Because Captain Fenton had begun to suspect him. The captain's loud quarrels with Lucy were not only about propriety. They were jealousy, raw and violent. He had seen the doctor's attentions. A clever man would silence that suspicion before it grew too loud. Mrs. Fenton let out a soft, strangled cry. Captain Fenton himself swore furiously, but the color drained from his face. Miss Marple's voice did not waver. Then came the business by the river. Again, Lucy is attacked. this time more directly. Dr. Leslie claims he was struck from behind. He presents himself as victim, and yet who is the only witness? Himself. Lucy remembers only a hand at her throat, a whisper urging silence. What could be more convenient? It was, I think, a stage drama. He struck himself lightly, or arranged a blow that would leave marks enough for sympathy. He carried Lucy downstream, leaving her dazed, and returned with his tale of being attacked. And so suspicion would continue to swirl elsewhere, at Caraway, at Mrs. Fenton, even at Lucy herself, but never at him. Inspector Graves opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple lifted a gentle hand. And now, the planted evidence. A vial in the vestry, too neat, too perfect. Everyone said at once it must be Caraway's, but who would know precisely where it would be found? The doctor, who often lingered with the vicar, who had free run of the place. And who more likely to use a vestry, a place of sanctity, as cover for guilt? It was clever, but too clever. In my experience, the neatest solutions are almost always false. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. But motives, you will say, what of them? Ah, human nature is always at the heart. Dr. Leslie is a man of ambition, but with little means. Lucy's inheritance, £2,000 from her godmother, was a fortune to him. To bind her to him through fear, to remove obstacles, to silence gossip, that was his aim. Captain Fenton, with his suspicions and his debts, stood in the way. Lucy's reputation, with whispers of impropriety, threatened the match. Mrs. Fenton's misery provided the perfect smokescreen. Every piece fitted his purpose. Lucy made dependent, rivals silenced, suspicion directed elsewhere. It was not madness nor sudden violence, but deliberate calculation. Lucy gave a broken sob. No. Oh no, I trusted you. Dr. Leslie's lips moved soundlessly. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes very gentle. I do not think he meant murder at first. The draft at the fete was intended to alarm, not kill. The revolver shot, perhaps, meant only to wound. But with each step, the stakes grew higher, and desperation pressed him on. Such is the way with crime, my dears. One act leads to another until the net tightens, and there is no escape. She looked around the room. Do you not see? No one else had the knowledge, the access, the composure. It was never Caraway, nor Mrs. Fenton, nor Lucy herself. It was always Dr. Leslie. There was silence. Then Mrs. Drayton cried shrilly, I knew it. I said so from the start. Though, of course, she had never said anything of the kind. Captain Fenton swore again, but weakly. Mrs. Fenton sat very still, her eyes closed, as though in prayer. Lucy sobbed softly, her hands covering her face. Inspector Graves, red to the ears, barked, Preposterous! You can't condemn a man on guesswork. Where's your proof, Miss Marple? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Proof? Why, Inspector, the proof lies in the very reactions we see before us. He cannot deny the opportunity. He cannot explain the bitterness Lucy tasted. He cannot account for the planted vial. And now, faced with the truth, he does not protest with calm innocence, but with silence. She turned her gaze upon Dr. Leslie. Well, doctor? For a moment he swayed as if struck. Then words burst from him, ragged, desperate. I loved her. He cried, pointing at Lucy. Don't you understand? I loved her, and she would have been mine if not for all of you. The captain with his sneers, Caraway with his interference, the whispers and the gossip. I only wanted her safe, dependent, needing me. I only wanted. He broke off, burying his face in his hands. Lucy uttered a faint cry. Captain Fenton struggled upright, shaking with fury. Mrs. Fenton gave a strange, shuddering sigh. Inspector Graves muttered, Well, I'll be. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. There, you see, Inspector. The confession always comes when one simply lets human nature speak for itself. The room seemed smaller, close with tension and grief. Dr. Leslie stood broken, his cleverness undone by the very psychology Miss Marple had so patiently observed. At last, the inspector straightened his shoulders. "Dr. Leslie," he said gruffly, "I must take you into custody. There'll be a proper trial and justice done." The doctor raised his head, eyes hollow. "Do what you will. It is over." He went quietly then, escorted by the sergeant, leaving the room heavy with silence. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "You see, Dolly," she said softly to Mrs. Bantry, "it was never the grand clues that mattered. It was the little things, a taste of bitterness, a handkerchief out of place, a look at the wrong moment. Human nature, Dolly. Always human nature. That is the beginning and the end of it." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Jane, you are uncanny. Absolutely uncanny." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not uncanny, my dear. Only observant. People will always tell you the truth if you only let them talk long enough." Summer's warmth lingered in Brindleford, though the village seemed strangely subdued. The roses bloomed as before, bees hummed lazily over lavender hedges, and the river wound its gentle path to Marleycombe, yet the air was different. The calm had been disturbed, the illusion of innocence broken. Dr. Leslie was gone. He had left quietly under escort, his pale face turned from the crowd that gathered in spite of themselves to watch. There was no triumph, only a kind of sadness, as though the village grieved for the man it had trusted. Some said he would plead madness. Others swore he would face the gallows. Either way, Brindleford would never see him again. Henry Carroway, released at last from suspicion, walked stiffly through the lane, his head held high, though bitterness burned in his eyes. Villagers, eager to make amends, greeted him awkwardly, but he returned only curt nods. "You were all too ready," he muttered once to Miss Marple, "to see a monster in me." She regarded him kindly. "People will always look first to the solitary, Mr. Carroway. It is unjust, but very human. You must try to forgive them." He gave her a thin smile. "You, madam, are the only one who saw clearly." At the Fenton house, matters were more complicated. Captain Fenton, though recovering, seemed diminished. His bluster returned in fits, but his voice cracked and his step faltered. His debts remained, his reputation tarnished, and his household uneasy. Mrs. Fenton moved about like a woman reprieved. Freed, at least in part, from her husband's shadow, she seemed to breathe more easily, though sorrow lay heavy in her eyes. She confided once to Miss Marple in a low voice, "It is strange, Miss Marple. I did not strike at him, yet another did, on my behalf, almost as if my bitterness called it into being. And now I feel guilty, as though I had willed it." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You must not reproach yourself, my dear. Hatred unspoken is not crime. It was another who took that darkness and made use of it. We are all tempted, but few are wicked enough to act." Mrs. Fenton wept quietly, but later, Miss Marple noticed, her step was steadier. Lucy Armitage, too, carried her scars. Gossip in Brindleford did not easily fade, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Some pitied her as a victim. Others muttered that she must have encouraged the doctor's obsession. Miss Marple visited her one afternoon, finding her pale but resolved. "I cannot remain here, Miss Marple," Lucy said. "Too many eyes, too many tongues. I shall go to an aunt in Bath, perhaps take a position there." Miss Marple nodded. "It may be wise. Villages are slow to forget, and you are young. You must not let this shadow your whole life." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "He said he loved me. But love, when it becomes a prison, is no love at all." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "It is possession." And possession, my dear, is very near to cruelty. Inspector Graves, for his part, remained blustery to the end. I always suspected the doctor, he told anyone who would listen, though of course he had done no such thing. Sergeant Collins, however, gave Miss Marple a respectful nod when they passed. You saved us a grave mistake, ma'am, he said simply. Miss Marple smiled modestly. Only by watching, Sergeant. People will always reveal themselves if one listens long enough. Mrs. Drayton, whose tongue had wagged most freely, became oddly subdued after the revelation. She avoided Miss Marple's gaze at first, but at last approached her outside the post office. You were right, Miss Marple. I see now I was too quick to accuse. I shan't be so hasty again. Miss Marple looked at her with gentle amusement. My dear, you will. It is in your nature. But perhaps you will pause a moment longer before speaking. That, at least, would be progress. Mrs. Drayton flushed, but to her credit, she smiled. The Bantrys, relieved that the storm had passed, returned to their comfortable routine. Mrs. Bantry, ever excitable, declared to her husband that Miss Marple was positively uncanny and spent many a happy hour recounting the whole affair to visitors, each time adding new dramatic flourishes. Miss Marple bore it with good humor. She knew Mrs. Bantry's exaggerations did no harm. Indeed, they turned the whole grim business into a tale fit for parlors and garden parties, where danger could be savored at a safe distance. Yet Miss Marple herself reflected more gravely. Sitting in the vicarage garden one evening, she spoke softly to the vicar. It is always the same, you know. People imagine crime belongs to the great cities, to dark alleys and strange foreigners. But I have seen more wickedness under the roses of an English village than anywhere else. Here, where everyone knows everyone, jealousy festers, grudges endure, and tempers boil beneath the politeness. Human nature, vicar, is the same everywhere. And where human nature is, crime will follow. The vicar sighed. It is a sober thought, Miss Marple. She smiled, but also a comforting one, in a way. For if one understands people, one can protect oneself and perhaps others. That is all I have ever tried to do. And so Brindleford returned outwardly to peace. The Fate Committee resumed its plans. The vicar preached on forgiveness. The grocer weighed out sugar as though nothing had happened. Children played by the river again, though their mothers called them back a little sooner. The scandal became, in time, a story, one to be told in low voices on winter nights, a tale of that dreadful summer when the doctor went wrong. Miss Marple left quietly, as she always did, her presence like a gentle breeze passing through the village. She carried her knitting and her wisdom back to St. Mary Mead, leaving behind a community a little wiser, a little sadder, and a little more aware of the darkness that can lurk behind lace curtains and tidy hedgerows. On the day of her departure, Mrs. Bantry walked with her to the gate. "Oh, Jane," she said, "I don't know how you do it. You see through people as though they were glass." Miss Marple smiled. "Not glass, my dear, only very human clay. One sees the cracks if one looks closely enough." Mrs. Bantry kissed her cheek. "Promise me you'll come again." "Brindleford may be peaceful now, but somehow I feel it won't stay that way." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear Dolly, nowhere ever does." With that, she stepped into the waiting carriage, and the village receded behind her, sunlit and serene, but never quite the same.